I was, I was actually thinking Jeff was gonna go first.
All right, then we'll turn it over to Jeff Pieper.
Okay,
Are you all right with
thanks, Don.
that? Are you all right with that, Jeff?
Sure, yeah, let's see how it goes.
All right.
Mine is saying that the share screen is disabled.
Okay, try it now, Jeff. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
And then if I go that. All right, does that work? Everybody see that?
Yep.
I'm on a single screen here, so I kind of lost my abilities to see my note and see you guys. So if something happens, just please let me know. My name is Jeff Pieper. I'm from Colorado State University Extension. I'm based in the Tri-River area, which is covering Mesa County, Delta County, Montrose County, and Ouray. And I work in commercial horticulture as well as natural resources. And, I was just given like kind of blanket overview of talking about cover crops. So I kind of wanted to start with a few things about the webinars and Lunch and Learn series, just in general across the board. Then I'm going to look at or talk through a few decision-making tools. I have a few scenarios to talk about, and then a look at some of the current research. And Don and I had a chat briefly about kind of direction and what we're going to talk about. And I hope this kind of fits the bill for what we're looking for. This was an idea of kind of looking at and talking to some of the technical service providers and some of the decision-making tools that I use when talking to participants in the soil health program. So I wanted to start with webinars and miracle cures. And I just wanted to start by saying that, be careful with what you're watching and be skeptical. I think that a lot of times when you're watching Lunch and Learns or webinars that what you're really watching is commercials. And so, be skeptical, be aware, and know when things are too good to be true and when people are promising everything you want and more.
Hey, Jeff.
And so, yes.
I'm not sure if you're clicking through your slides, but I only see your first slide still. I don't think we see your presentation mode. So you might have to share like your whole screen instead of just the window. And then we should be able to see when you hit presentation mode.
How about that? Did that switch that?
Right now you're not sharing anything with us.
Uh-oh. How's that?
That looks better.
Looks good. Yep.
Okay. How's that?
Yep. We see you clicking through the slides now. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for letting me know. So again, just to kind of get back on track here with the idea of Lunch and Learns or webinars is, I kind of go up to them being a little bit skeptical, and hopefully you guys with me talking here or starting are a little bit skeptical, but I'm not selling anything. So hopefully that doesn't turn out this way. But, does what these people say and what you're learning about make sense? And if so, how and why? And then look into who else has tried it. And look into, are there any other similar trials or products? And how do those results compare? For instance, I think last time I was on here, we had one about algae and using algae as a fertilizer increaser or crop return, increase in yield, increase potential. And CSU has conducted similar trials, looking at those results and see how they compare to the product that was being advertised there. And then how is the product applied? So sometimes a lot of these additional products, when you look at the algae or you look at other fertility programs, a lot of times additional water is provided to, say, dryland crops, or another spray or fertility program will be applied to the crop, adding a whole nother round of irrigation, which can often boost performance in your crops. And then lastly, I think one of the things to look at is what does it cost? Does it make sense to scale this up for your production system? A lot of times, some of these things that are being sold make sense in a lab or make sense on a small scale acreage, but does it really work for putting it into a 20 acre, 30 acre, 1,000-acre system? So how does that compare to what you normally do? What is your normal fertility regime, and how does that cost comparative analysis work? And what is your potential return on investment if you do end up using something? So looking at their statistical analysis. And if you do decide to try some of these products, or you want to look into trying something out, start small. Set up a small trial. Use your growers to establish maybe 1-2 acres. Try it out, see how it works, and keep good records. Make sure that you're actually able to determine if this product was successful for you. Okay, so moving on to cover crops. I think that one of the things that I started with that idea of these miracle cures and or catch-alls or snake oil segment was because I think cover crops can kind of get lumped into that. It's something that you can add to your field or add to your rotation, and it can do all these things that are going to be wonderful for your farm. And it's all going to be better if you can just incorporate cover crops. And again, I think that this is something that we have to be really careful when you're being a technical service provider, looking at how cover crops actually fit into the system and when they make sense and when they don't make sense, and or how to make them make sense for given scenarios. So I'm not here really to talk about decision-making tools. There are a lot of decision-making tools. There are seed catalogs, which plant to crop, or to which crop to plant when, how much to plant, when to plant the plant. And there are different things regarding what soil health parameters that plant might offer. There are planting calendars, there's species characteristics and species functions. However, I'll say in Colorado, in my experience at least, I think we are lacking some regionally specific outcomes and how to determine those success. And one of those success, I think, can come down to seeding rates, especially when you're looking through the literature. One thing that is coming to the Western states is the Western Cover Crop Council. And there's a species selection tool coming soon. There's also been current trials being conducted up outside of Meeker. I'll say this has some beautiful resources, really great examples, and situational farming, and nice summative studies on cover crops used mainly across Washington, Oregon, and California for now. So we do have a lot of decision-making tools in ag, and I think that when you look at evidence-based research, you have these different levels of quality of evidence and volume of information. And I think the nice thing about cover cropping right now, we're getting to be into this first level of highest quality of evidence, where you have systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And I'll be talking about more at the end. Some of these kind of different things where we're able to reflect on what's been done in cover cropping and kind of see how that's happening on a broader scale, combining different evidence from across multiple trials and different things to kind of get a better summary of what's happening with cover crops on a whole. And of course, we also have tons of background information and expert opinions that have been conducted across the country to allow those systematic reviews to take place. And I think when you talk about ag just in general too, we have a lot of different decision-making tools, right? And one of those tools I think is most well known, I think, is integrated pest management. And so you have a lot of different tools and decision-making advice based on what your problem is, and how that kind of approach can work for cover cropping. I think works really, really well when you're looking at all these different things that can cover crops can offer. So determining the grower's #1 concern and addressing that first is a great place to start. And I think the challenge with cover crops is that everybody is trying to kind of get these all at once. And the difficulty and differences between this and, say, like an IPM tool is that you're often encouraged, I think, or producers are wanting all of these things at once. Whereas with an IPM tool, you're usually addressing like one specific insect or pest control mechanism through different practices. And so I think it almost kind of turns some of the way we think about ag a little bit on its head in a bit of a roundabout way. So when I think about decision making and where to start, I think the #1 thing, and I think the thing that we are lacking as technical service providers, or or from an academic standpoint in general, is our ability to chat with growers, to meet them where they're at, and understand where they want to go. So what do they want for their farm? And I think that we need to look at that holistically on a larger scale, and start kind of maybe building the process backwards. Start with that end goal and build from the end back to the finish, and figure out how cover crops will achieve both their long-term and short-term goals. And then we can start working at the nailing in, really refining down. How do you water? How often? What equipment do you have? What do you have, and when do you want to plant? What's the differentiation between your cash crops and cover crops? And what are the goals that you really want from that cover crop that you think that you can achieve? So ideally, really, we want to help them refine their needs and desires into what is practical, and figure out what those opportunities are for the cover crops. So to kind of set this up and going into the future here, I wanted to work on a few scenarios. And I think that these will be pretty straightforward to most people, but it just kind of gives you a little bit of the reality of what's going on. And these are actual scenarios that I've seen this year, and kind of, I think, dial it back again to looking at how we talk to growers, how we take it from their long-term vision and go back to the beginning to really address their needs and get to what they want. So here are 2 pictures, not exactly of the places that we went to, but I think this picture set up the scenario very well. On the left, the idea there was that it's generally just a hay field, and the producer there wanted to come in, and talking with them, they wanted to look at turning over the entire field to put in cover crops to increase wildlife habitat, potentially have some places where they could put beehives, pollinator habitat, maybe a few shade trees, maybe a few fruit trees, generally kind of like this holistic, all-encompassing approach. And myself, the conservation district, and a CDA employee were out there talking with them about this. And it took us probably about the better part of an hour to really get down to what this grower wanted. And really what that came to be was that they didn't need to or want to turn over this field at all. If anything, maybe they needed to do a no-till drill to reestablish some of the stuff that was already there. Their grass cover was poor here or there, or they wanted to mix in a legume here or there to get a little bit more pollinator habitat. And I think that conversation went from being, I've talked to the neighbor, they're going to come plow the entire field, we'll reseed it in cover crops, and the whole place will be the most beautiful pollinator habitat, hayfield, wildlife habitat you've ever seen. And so that went from being, again, this conversation about how everything will change and improve with cover crops to being, what you already have is basically what you're asking for. Let's work on focusing on perfecting what you have rather than restarting and hitting the reset button. I think when you look at the picture on the right, we had a small acreage scenario where, again, they were kind of wanted to have a high functioning pasture for a few animals, maybe incorporate a small orchard and have a few other items. And to do so, they wanted to use cover crops. And talking through this with them and visiting their site, it was very clear to see that cover crops were not going to solve anything, and really learning and going to the basics of farming and pasture management was where we had to start with this person. And so I think the only reason that I wanted to add that in is just because cover crops are a piece of the puzzle and they're not always the answer. And I think setting the stage with the grower and determining those needs first before we figure out anything else at the farm is the most important step. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think that having those longer conversations and building that time to work through some of these questions and or concerns, dreams, and visions with the growers is of utmost importance. Okay, so building on some of these similar themes, my general background is mainly with small scale veggies. So I have a lot of people that come to me that in Palisade area that really want to, they buy a small acreage, 1 to 2 acres, maybe less. And they want to turn it into a veggie farm. So one of the most important things, again, is determining that business plan. Do they need all this land at once? Are they going to be able to come in, grow 2 acres of veggie all at once? Or is there a possibility for a staged expansion? And if so, what does that look like? What is the current situation of the farm? Is there a crop already existing? Is there something that they're able to manage in different ways, in cutting of blocks? Maybe they do half-acre blocks to really allow them to succeed before just turning over the entire thing. I think a lot of this goes into my role or our role as TAPS is that we can save people a lot of headaches with a few conversations. Determining how they want to do things in a way that they can actually manage is really, really important to set the stage before they just encounter failure. So, and then we can get to the plant management control options, right? So what type of irrigation? How are they going to water this cover crop if they're only using drip? What kind of equipment do they have? How are they going to manage the biomass that they're going to grow? And a lot of growers, especially on small scale, aren't able to really, they're able to see the benefits of cover crop, but they're not really able to see the finer details of how they might grow this crop with drip tape, how they might manage this crop with the equipment that they have. Okay. The other challenge that I see a lot, again, with small scale vegetables is end of the year cover cropping. And people want to manage a successful veggie farm, and they think that they have to have that late season cover crop, which is really, really difficult because of their cash crops. Their cash crops are generally in the way. They're trying to elongate their season as much as possible. So again, that challenge is timing. You have to work in your seeding, your incorporation, when your cash crop windows, what are they? So I think instead of looking fully just at the end of the year, how are you able to bring that into your rotation as part of the system rather than just focusing on end of the year? And then again, why? Why do they want to just put in a cover crop at the end of the year? What are they looking for? Are they looking for erosion control? Are they looking for increased fertility? Are they looking to lower their input costs? Are there other ways that they could achieve the same goals through a different method? And in general, just understanding how to get the most out of your cover crop. So if it is this increase in fertility, when is the best time to incorporate that? How am I going to get the most out of the incorporation to decrease my input costs and or gain the fertility? And again, I think one of the things that is a challenge for a lot of the small scale growers is they just see and want cover crops. And I think looking outside the box and addressing this in different ways through kind of this picture above or below, with perennial covers can be a way that a lot of people don't really think about as far as weed management. They can use that for fertility as well. And again, when you think about this larger idealistic stuff of weed control through biomass suppression, it can be really, really challenging, one, to have access to the implements, and then two, you often need more than one implement. And a lot of times, in my experience, these growers don't have access to those or don't have an understanding of what they actually need to incorporate this. Another challenge, I think, is high tunnel cover cropping. A lot of times in small scale scenarios, you're using the same crops over and over and over. Although I would say that most small scale veggie producers are now starting to diversify quite a bit with intercropping to change that up a bit. But I think figuring out, what is the timing of that cash crop? What are the potential windows for cover? What is the cover crop desires? Is it soil health, fertility? Is it nutrient cycling? Is it just simply crop cycling? Is it nutrient recycling? And then especially in the high tunnel, how are you going to get rid of it? What's going to be your strategy for termination, weed control, and irrigation? Trying to keep that high tunnel growing. You might have extended season capabilities, but do you have water extension capabilities for later in the year? So again, I think it's taking that long-term approach and kind of dialing it backwards to help them to get to where they want to go by addressing some of these needs that are oftentimes just misunderstood or not addressed. I think that conclusion of moving to cover crops is always kind of the first step rather than looking at that as kind of the last step. I also have a lot of experience with looking at orchards. We're having a lot of questions with orchards as well. In the past, they used to do a lot of fallowing of fields with pasture grass and alfalfa mixes. And now we're starting to look more at turf grasses. And I think the goal there, it again, becomes very, very important. Is it weed control? Is it erosion control? Is it increasing filtration? Is it dust mitigation? What are the grower really looking for? And then how often are they willing to reseed? Some of the turf grasses don't do great with a lot of repeated low mowing like a lot of the growers do. Don't just last long in general if they're lower grow or turf quality. And then what are the water needs? Are you able to get water onto it to keep it green and to keep it to meet your goal? And then there's always the question of adding legumes. And I think that for legume, one of the biggest questions is organic versus conventional. You have a huge opportunity for fertility, especially when you're doing something like a side discharge mower. Up there, you can see in the top right-hand corner with the mower is discharging the green material, which can be used as a fertility augmentation right into the tree row. However, that kind of creates issues with voles. Voles not only love that cover, but they also love legumes. So speaking with your grower, just asking them, is that trade-off worth it? Do you worry about voles? Do you have vole issues to begin with? And what might that do if you add legumes into that mix? And then again, also, if you're going to use a legume like alfalfa, how that translates to fruit quality, and if they've had problems with that. A lot of growers have a lot of experience with these things, and I think just addressing the concerns and the issues with them, and whether or not it's worth the trade-off of having true bugs cause cat facing on your fruit. Again, just having that conversation and addressing their needs in more of the ways than one, and bringing up some of the concerns. Also, there's potential for using cover crops in replant disease. And we've done some trials showing that, different plant species definitely augment the microbial communities and have a great potential use in mitigating replant disease. But how does that fit into their rotation? And how long does that window look like? Is that a multi-year establishment? Is that something that they're able to fit into their long-term goals as a farm? Okay, so I think another thing to look at that's really, really important for growers to understand is how you're going to manage this stuff. I talked about that on a small scale as far as veggies, and a lot of times spraying is out the window for those folks. But even I would say on larger scale farms, people can have trouble terminating their crops. And so I think using current research to figure out what is the most effective control given your cover crop treatment can be really, really helpful to growers. So using current research to kind of help guide some of that decision-making tools, if they know that they want to spray down their crops, knowing the differences in efficacy between spraying down grass covers and spraying down a legume-based cover can be really, really helpful. You see that at the very bottom of both of these charts, the glyphosate is doing fairly well on a grass cover, not really well on a legume cover. So being able to augment your choices of control and termination methods, in this case, spraying regimen, is really, really important. I also say that, when we were talking about before and the different approaches and reviews and being able to have enough standing research now to be able to conduct these large scale reviews, some of the cover cropping things are starting to change the understanding of how cover crops change the soil profile and what it does to your soil health parameters, I think is also really important. So most recently, I think the thing that's being challenged is water availability. So there are a lot of large-scale reviews going on across the world on water holding capacity and water availability for plants, and saying that, as a goal for cover cropping, this shouldn't be one of the things that we're really trying to focus on, as the literature and most of the studies that have been done don't really show a huge increase in availability of water for plant uptake. And I think that also is starting to come out when it starts to talk about making recommendations as far as monocultures versus mixes. And so this can be a whole ball of wax here. Trying to untangle this ball of yarn can be really, really tricky. So relying on some of these larger reviews to look at how cover crop mixes versus monocultures offer benefits one over the other, it can be really challenging. But some of these larger systematic reviews are showing that most mixes don't outperform monocultures in a large variety of different trials and parameters. So you can look at cover crop productivity, weed suppression, nitrogen retention, soil water conservation, soil biology, crop yield promotion, and biomass stability. And what they're seeing is that just in general, if you're comparing things, most of the time they're not seeing one outperforming the other. They're performing quite similarly. And what it comes down to really is seeding rates, which oftentimes are not controlled for, which can be really, really difficult to make comparisons between. However, they are seeing that at times the legume and cereal mixes are outperforming just a regular monoculture. And it doesn't really matter how many legumes or how many different cereals you have. But when you're looking at those seeding rates of increases of 120 to 200%, you can see why some of these things such as weed suppression, cover crop productivity, or biomass might be exaggerated based on that. So it's just something to think about. And I think that's going on a larger scale too, in a lot of the more row crop areas. Stuff out of Nebraska is also saying that, you know, the best thing to do is to go and look at, again, what is your most important goal? What are you trying to do? And oftentimes, if you're trying to mix in several different things and several different goals, you're probably going to have a trade-off there. So maybe picking a single species that's well adapted for your number one goal might be most productive and or a better economical choice. So, you know, again, I think when we have so many trials that have been conducted, we're now starting to kind of be able to unravel some of these challenges and things that we weren't able to really see before. We were able to see them a little bit more clearly. So lastly, I'd like to talk about just one of the things, you know, when we are talking about the soil health program, but I think it's also a good reason to think, or a good opportunity to think about why people are not using cover crops. And so Sarah put out a survey of people, like why they're not adopting cover crops across the country. And the top 4 reasons there are time and labor for planting and maintenance, economics, so it's just not economically viable, or they think it's too expensive. They're worried about the increase of weeds, whether that be actually the cover crop becoming a weed or the cover crop not controlling the weeds as well as they think, making it harder to plant the cover crops. And then they are still feeling a lack of inability to choose the right cover crop. So again, I think working through some of those conversations with them on how and why can be really good in understanding, developing understanding on what those things might be and some of those things. So, but if they were going to adopt cover crops, the things that they'd be looking for, number 1, are increased organic matter, reduced erosion, increased yields, and reduced compaction. So I think that we can take some of those needs or desires and kind of work them into the whys they don't incorporate them to kind of help build that going forward. And people are less interested in weed control and a source of nitrogen or fertility management, according to this study. So just again, kind of another opportunity to get a perspective on barriers to adoption, and maybe you can just start some of your conversations using these barriers to address some of those concerns on the bat. So when you're looking for other resources, like I said to start, there's tons of different resources out for choosing the proper crop, planting calendars, etc. I think one of the best books that I've used is Managing Cover Crops Properly by Sayre. There's also the Western Cover Crops Council, which I just discussed already, for a lot of decision-making tools. But again, I think going back and asking to your cohort, working with your growers and what's working, why is it working, conducting a lot of site visits, setting up your own small trials, conducting follow-ups, and being willing to learn along with them. I think a lot of this is a trial and error, and starting with the basics and moving forward. So hopefully that was kind of in the direction of where we were looking to go, and sets Don up to start with his presentation here.
Thank you, Jeff. So I think for the sake of time, we're just going to have Don jump right into his presentation. If anybody has specific questions for Jeff, please put them in the chat, either to the whole group or directly to Jeff. But if Don, you want to share your screen and get started with your presentation. And then I think you're still muted, Don, so if you could unmute.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, this sounds great.
All right. Well, cover crops. I don't know when cover crop, the whole subject of cover crops started. I'm going to say 10, 15 years ago. But I wanted to talk about, kind of give you an idea of the definition of cover crops. Because, the CRP program, the Conservation Reserve Program, started in somewhere like 85, 86. The goal was to take 40 million acres of farm ground out of crop production and put it into permanent cover. And one of the things the farmers had to do was put in a cover crop. And so a definition of a cover crop, according to the NRCS, was you planted a warm season, sterile crop, which was usually a sorghum crop, in June, and you let it grow all summer long, and then it would die sometime in September, October, because it was sterile. If it produced any seed, none of that seed would grow. And what you accomplished is that when you grew that sorghum crop, it really reduced weed seed production. And also it provided cover so that in December of the year, you could plant your desired perennial mixes. Most of the time they were native, into that standing cover crop. That cover crop was not to be grazed You could not graze it. You could not mow it. You couldn't bale it. You weren't going to use it. You were going to plant right into that dead cover. And so in the spring of the year, if you had a mixture of warm season, cool season perennials, the cool seasons would start growing March the 1st, and then the warm seasons would probably start growing somewhere in the middle of May or 1st of June. So that cover crop also provided protection from wind and water erosion. And because you had really good cover, a lot of mulch on the soil surface, your evaporation loss was very small. And any snow that you would get through the winter, essentially most all of it would stay on that field because you had standing cover. Maybe the stalks were a foot tall, or in some cases it was 3 or 4 foot tall, and so the snow would not blow off of your field. So that was a cover crop, and the term cover crop was used that way until about 10 or 15 years ago, when then the topic of soil health came around, and now all of a sudden cover crops kind of took on a new definition. And so what is a cover crop now pertaining to soil health? And Jeff covered a lot of this, but I'll give you my rendition. All of a sudden, we're going to plant these mixtures of grasses, forbs, legumes, and it was going to create all this soil health. And that in some cases might be true, but in other cases it didn't work very well. So what I want to talk about is crop rotation on dry land, and my experience with working with dryland farmers in eastern Colorado. Probably most of you know that the #1 crop in eastern Colorado is winter wheat. And I started learning about dryland farming in 1976 when I was working in Sterling for what used to be called the Soil Conservation Service, which is now called Natural Resources Conservation Service. So I didn't know anything about dryland farming, and I had to learn about it. And I worked with dryland farmers. And one of the first things I learned is that they planted a wheat crop and they could grow wheat every other year. So in a 10-year period, they could grow a wheat crop 5 years out of those 10 years. And like some of the locals would say, joking around, Don, we can get 5 crops if we're lucky, if we don't get drought out or hailed out, which there's a lot of truth to that. So they might only get 3 crops in 10 years. But the question then is, why did they summer fallow? And I actually interviewed a gentleman that they had given Conservation of the Year award to. I think his last name was Buckholz. And anyway, in that conversation with him, I said, well, Mr. Buckholz, now remember this was in 1976. I said, Mr. Buckholz, what was the #1 factor in your mind that has improved dryland farming here in eastern Colorado? And he just kind of looked at me, and I said, like fertilizer or new varieties of wheat, or at that time they were calling it stubble mulch farming. Now we call it no-till farming. I said, and he said, uh, He said it was when we realized that we could make more money growing a crop every other year instead of growing a crop every year. And the importance of that is that I, not growing up being a dryland farmer, realized that, hey, it's all moisture and it's farming the moisture. How do you retain that moisture? And so in Colorado, if somebody harvests a wheat crop, like let's just say they harvested a wheat crop in 2024, they harvested around July 4th. Now, what they would do is not plant a crop until September of 2025. And what did they do during that period of time from when they harvested a crop till when they planted a new crop? They controlled the weeds. Back in 76, there was no Roundup. The idea was to do minimum tillage. Instead of tilling it 10 times in that 14, 15-month period, they only tilled it 2 times or 3 times. And they did it with special equipment that did not turn the soil over the top. They didn't turn, like when you disc or plow, you're taking soil from 4 inches or 6 inches deep and you're putting it on the top, and what was on the top is now buried. So you're exposing that and losing a lot of moisture. The reason I'm going into this is because there is an ARS, Agricultural Research Service site in Akron. They did a study on cover crops 10 years ago, maybe longer, and they determined that in our rainfall area, cover crops would not work because we're at a 14-inch precip, and at our latitude, the amount of evaporation we get is just too much, and we couldn't work it in and still grow that winter wheat crop that was so important. Matter of fact, I've talked to dryland farmers in eastern Colorado and asked them, hey, what about cover crops? Can you do that? What about growing something else besides winter wheat? Well, actually, they've tried research planting a lot of different crops. And although we can grow other crops on dryland in eastern Colorado, still the number one crop is winter wheat. And the reason is because it produces a lot of biomass. It can protect the soil surface, and it does well on 14 inches as long as we summer fallow. But if you try to plant another crop in between the during that 15 month period, all it's doing is using up that moisture that you're trying to save to grow your next winter wheat crop. So that's the challenge of growing a cover crop on dry land. Different cover crops have been tried, and it's hard for the dryland farmer to justify growing it because it's using up the moisture that is necessary to grow his winter wheat crop.
So I just want to quickly jump in and say, I know we're at time, but since we didn't give Don his fair share of the time, if everyone can please accommodate and just stay maybe 10 minutes longer.
Yep.
And
All right.
Don, if that's okay with you, for just another 10 minutes. And so we won't intrude on people's schedule for too much longer. Thank you.
All right. I'll do my best. Thank you. So next, I want to go to crop rotation on irrigated land. There's the, by the way, if it sounds like I'm against cover crops, I'm not. They're great. It's trying to figure out how to use them and still be profitable. That's the big challenge. So on irrigated cropland, the you don't have the problem of water because you got irrigation, right? So why not plant cover crops? I've actually, when I say we, my staff and I have worked with some very good farmers trying to incorporate cover crops on irrigated land. And the challenge is similar to dry land, but for different reasons. The we all know how precious water is in Colorado, and we all know what's happening in Colorado. Irrigated farmland is becoming less and less because municipalities are buying the farmland, taking the water off, and using it as they need to use it. Okay, so what does that have to do with, you know, irrigated farm ground? Well, irrigated farm ground's expensive and the water they use is expensive. So to grow a cover crop that they cannot market is very hard. We work with some irrigated farmers that have incorporated. Some of them have tried for 8 years or so and then realized they just can't do it and they quit. We're working with others that have continued doing it, and hopefully, you know, they see the benefit. Working with a potato grower, and he's really seeing the benefit of these cover crops, and so they're great to use for that reason. One of the things that I saw early on when cover crops came around, when the whole idea came around, is that there were people trying to figure out, I think, be blunt, how to make money off of cover crop mixes. And so they came up with these mixes. They had different names to them, like champagne mix and all this, but they were really a mixed bag of species that some of those species wouldn't even really grow here. So they gave them, you know, real neat names, but they really didn't do a good job of what they're supposed to be doing because a lot of those species didn't even work here. So I wanted to show you this chart that I was introduced to. It's a good little chart because it shows the grasses, non-legumes, you know, so broadleaf species that you might want to use like canola or rape. And then it shows those things that are broadleaf but are legumes. And then it shows warm season grasses. So it's a good little chart to try to figure out what to plant and why you might want to mix different things from different categories. And so I'm going to take you to this because one of the things that Jeff, you alluded to was, you know, it's got to be affordable. And so what I did is design some mixes that I know the species would work. And so like this spring cover crop mix, all of those are spring crops that if you plant it in March are going to grow. Then I designed a summer cover crop mix because they have to be warm season. Cowpeas, millet, sorghum, soybeans, all of those can be planted in a mix in June, and they're going to do well because they like to grow in the summer. And then I designed a fall winter cover crop mix where people take a crop off and they want to plant it like in September or late August, maybe early October, and they'll plant that mix and then it would go through the winter and still be there the next spring. I designed a spring cover crop mix. And the reason I designed that one is there's people that wanted to plant their cover crop in the spring, but they wanted it to be able to grow something in that cover crop to grow clear into, say, August, September, October. And so these are ingredients that have all been grown in this area, and they're fairly affordable. When you start getting cover crop mixes that cost $5 or $6 a pound, these large farmers won't, large acreage farmers won't do it. And so you have to have mixes that are adaptable. And fancy was, that idea entered my mind, but fancy doesn't make it on a production agricultural type situation. It's got to be affordable, and the species, you got to know that those species are going to be able to grow here. So due to time, we're trying to do that in 10 minutes. So hopefully I brought kind of give you a little different perspective than what Jeff brought up. Jeff covered a lot of material, but I wanted to try to bring this down to a very practical approach. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. So I know this was a really long info session, so I appreciate everyone's patience and accommodating us going a little over. I will send out Jeff and Don's contact information in my usual follow-up email to you all. So if you have any specific questions that you just didn't get a chance to ask, please know you can always still reach out to either Jeff or Don. With that, does anybody have any questions or comments or anything related to the announcements that John made at the beginning of the session? Otherwise, we can call it here.
I'd love to ask Don a question.
Yeah.
Sure.
Hi, Don, this
Yes.
is Annie Oberlin.
Hi, Annie.
I have a question for you. How are you doing? So when using a cover crop to get perennial grasses established, as a cover, do you recommend seeding into a cover crop stubble, or do you recommend having that perennial mix in with the cover crop? So like the example that I'm thinking of is like a cover crop of like a spring cover of oats and then putting like intermediate and tall wheatgrass in with it. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, so that is actually defined as a nurse crop. So when you're planting a perennial crop with an annual crop, that really is we either call it a nurse crop or a companion crop. It's not a cover crop.
Oh, great.
That's the difference. A cover crop, to me, the strictest definition of a cover crop is you're planting this crop for reasons like erosion control, or you want to improve your microbial action, all these good things, and your intention isn't to harvest it. It's just you're planting it to build up your soil, and then when that crop is done, or when you terminate it, now you plant the crop that you want. The thing that I didn't mention and I want to mention now is crop rotation. In my mind, is one of the best ways to address soil health, and it's not a cover crop.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, hey, I'm going to be 77 in May. When I was growing up, everybody in our area rotated crops. And nowadays, you see somebody growing corn for 20 years in a row on the same piece of ground. But that's another talk at a different date.
We could talk for an hour or two. I'll follow up with you.
Yep,
Thank
you
you.
bet. Thank you.
Alrighty, thank you so much to everyone who stayed on. Hopefully this was a very informative session, and like John said, this is our last info session, so keep an eye out for emails from us, and we will see you all again back on Zoom later this fall. Enjoy the rest of
Thank
your day,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks to our speakers. Much appreciated.